Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So it's a weekend, that means we don't have a ton of cards to talk about, but we do have a few interesting ones. So I want to do a video, break it down, and then tomorrow things pick back up in full with a whole week of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So before we jump into it, a couple of quick reminders. One is, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers, you'll find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. You can sort them, filter them, all that good stuff. Number two, if you want to pick up some Kamigawa cards for yourself, you can do that from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish and even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes and they will hook you up. So anyway, let's talk Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So first up today, we have what is probably the best Reconfigure card we've seen so far in Lion Sash. So Lion Sash, 2 mana 1/1, artifact creature equipment cap. You can pay 1 mana and exile a card from a graveyard. If it's a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and then you can also give the equipped creature +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. So you can move it around, the counter stick with it, and you can reconfigure it for 2. So attach it to a creature or unattach it from a creature, only at sorcery speed, all that stuff. This is essentially the white equipment version of Scavenging Ooze. You don't get to gain the life. It starts off with 1 less power, but still, this is graveyard hate that comes in the form of an equipment, which I think means this card has potential kind of across formats, specifically because you can find it with stuff like Stoneforge Mystic in Fighter class and Standard. Being able to tutor up a Scavenging Ooze, I think is a really big deal. I'm not saying in Modern you're going to replace your Cauldron Completes or your Batter Skulls with Lion Sash, but I think this is a card that will be in your 75 somewhere, because when you run into Dredge or when you run into a Reanimator deck, having this one of equipment that you can find with Stoneforge and essentially just hose your opponent's deck is really powerful. Plus, Lion Sash isn't the worst creature on its own. Like, starting as a 1/1 is a bit annoying, but it does grow quickly. We've seen that with Scavenging Ooze, and Scavenging Ooze only grew if you hit a creature. Lion Sash grows on any permanent. So in a format like Modern, this means you can grow it by eating fetch land. So even though it starts as a 1/1, it's going to get big pretty quick, and its reconfigure cost isn't even that expensive. So as far as what this card actually does, in Standard, we do have a reasonable number of things that use the graveyard. We got Old Growth Trolls coming back from the graveyard, Skyclave Shades, Galvanic Iterations, other flashback spells, Memory Deluge, so there's plenty of targets. And then once you get back to older formats, you have even more. In Historic, you have all the Cauldron Familiar shenanigan decks, one of the best decks in the format, based around looping stuff from the graveyard. You got Dredge decks. In Modern and Legacy, you got Reanimator decks, which have been on a rise since Archon of Cruelty was printed. So there are plenty of targets for this card. Whether or not this means you're going to put it in the main deck, that remains to be seen. The biggest downside, as I mentioned before, is it doesn't start off as the most powerful creature, and I think this could be a problem in Standard in specific. Like, White Weenie is one of the better decks in Standard. I don't know if you just replace Luminarch Aspire or Intrepid Adversary or Thalia with a 2 mana 1/1, even though it has so much upside, so much potential to grow, but I think as a sideboard option, it should be really good. When you go back to Modern, kind of the same thing. I don't think that you are going to drop Cauldron Complete or Batter Skull or Sword of Fire and Ice or in Hammer Time decks Colossus Hammer to run Lion Sash. I don't even know if you're going to play Lion Sash in the main deck, but I do think this is strong enough as a hoser in the right matchup that it's going to show up at a minimum in a sideboard, and I think it even could have potential in the main deck as a one of just hanging out in your deck, and then you grab it in the matchups where it's good and hope you don't grab it in the matchups where graveyard hate isn't relevant. I think this is also just an ultra staple in Commander decks. We always talk about how Commander decks should play more graveyard hate. Lion Sash is really, really good in equipment deck. You have all those same synergies we were talking about, Stoneforge, other tutors. Plus, if you're playing an equipment-based deck, you just want as many equipment as possible to trigger your Srom or grow your Kemba or Wylith or whatever. You got all these shenanigans for your equipment. So I think that Lion Sash will make your equipment-based Commander deck pretty much every single time as one of your better equipment in your deck. So I think Lion Sash is actually really really good. I think this is one of the better cards we've seen so far for older formats. Like I said, probably going to mostly be like a one of tutor target, I would think, a sideboard card maybe for Stoneforge decks, for other equipment decks. In Standard, we'll have to wait and see. Like, I think it does have a chance to be a main deck card, but like we talked about before, there are a lot of competing white 2-drops, and this one does start off with lower power, even though it has a lot of upside if the game goes long, so we'll have to wait and see how it shakes out. But definitely keep this one in mind. I think this is probably the best Reconfigure card we've seen so far, and has potential from Standard all the way back through Modern, Legacy, and in Commander as well. Speaking of Reconfigure equipment, we got another interesting one in Lizard Blade. So this is a red Reconfigure equipment, 2-mana 1/1 artifact creature equipment lizard. It has double strike. It gives the equipped creature double strike, and you can reconfigure it for 2 mana. So Lizard Blade, it's essentially a fencing ace, a 2-mana 1/1 double striker that is also an upgraded Fireshrieker, more or less. Well, mostly upgraded. An equipment that gives double strike. It'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. This is a case where I feel like being a creature is going to be a big drawback in some cases, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So Lizard Blade, in a deck that is playing a bunch of equipment, is kind of a scary card because a fencing ace, a 2-mana 1/1 double striker, that's a pretty decent card to load up with equipment in the early game, and then later in the game, if you get a bigger threat, well, then you can just move Lizard Blades onto the big threat, get in for a ton of damage. Definitely not as scary as Embercleave. One of the downsides of Reconfigure is it is pretty slow in sorcery speed. Like, you can only reconfigure as a sorcery, so this means your opponent is going to see the double strike coming. Part of what made Embercleave so insane is you just like attack with everything, wait to see how your opponent blocks, flash it in, hit your opponent for an absurd amount of damage and win the game. Lizard Blade is never going to do that. Like, you're going to be equipping this at sorcery speed, your opponent can chump block or whatever, can kill your Lizard Blade in response to the equip, so it's definitely not as scary as something like Embercleave, but I still think it's a fairly reasonable card. My biggest concern for Standard, honestly, is I think this is a case where being a creature is a pretty huge drawback. Spikefield Hazard is really heavily played, like one of the top 10 cards in Standard. A lot of decks are playing the full 4 copies because it comes attached to a land, so the opportunity cost is really low. Spikefield Hazard seems really good against Lizard Blade. Like, it just snipes it for a single mana, and it's kind of a free roll because it's in your land slot, so I worry that maybe that will keep Lizard Blade from seeing much play. Like, a 2-mana 1/1 is kind of in a rough spot in a world where a lot of people are playing Spikefield Hazards, so we'll have to wait and see. I mean, the nightmare is you play this, and either it just gets immediately sniped, or your opponent just waits until you go to Reconfigure and then snipes it, so that might push it out of Standard. On the other hand, I mean, if you can get this on a Goldspan Dragon or an Old Growth Troll or something with a bunch of Halana and Elena counters, this can deal a ton of damage, so the upside is there, but there's also a lot of risk built in. In formats like Modern, I mean, I think you would just tutor up Embercleave in most decks if you wanted this effect. I don't know, maybe it could be a one-of in some really weird deck. Embercleave does need you to go kind of wide, so maybe if you're some sort of Voltron-y Stoneforge deck where you're just going big on one creature, your Blizzard Blades could be better, but really, I don't expect this to see a ton of play in Modern just because we got other options in Commander. All the stuff that makes me skeptical of Lizard Blade in Standard, especially getting sniped by cheap efficient removal, that's much less of a concern. No one's playing Spikefield Hazard. Well, maybe me, but most people are not playing Spikefield Hazard in the Commander format. You don't gotta worry about lightning bolts and fatal pushes and that cheap efficient removal, which I think means Lizard Blade is just an upgrade over Fireshrieker for red-based equipment decks, Wylith, various like Arden, Rogak piles, so I think this will see a decent amount of play in Commander, where you can tutor this up, stick it on your Voltron-y Commander, double strike, kill someone in one shot. So Lizard Blade, being a 1/1, makes me a little bit nervous about what it'll do in Standard, but it is an interesting, cheap equipment that does reconfigure relatively efficiently, so I think it's got a shot, at least in Commander. We also got the red member of the Invoke cycle, Invoke Calamity. So 5 mana, including 4 red mana instant, you may cast up to 2 instants and or sorcery spells with total mana value of 6 or less from your graveyard and or hand without paying their mana cost, and if those spells would be put into your graveyard, exile them instead, and then exile Invoke Calamity. So Invoke Calamity, this card's kind of insane. For 5 mana, you're getting 6 mana, well, hopefully 6 mana, worth of spells at instant speed, and you got a ton of flexibility. Like, you can cast 2 sorceries, you can cast 2 instants, a mixture, you can cast them from graveyard or your hand. This card seems really, really powerful. So we've seen cards like this in the past, cards that let us cast spells from our graveyard, be pretty powerful in Constructed. A Finale of Promise, Goblin Dark Dweller, Torrential Gearhulk, Red Order Canis, these are all very Constructed playable cards, and I think it is likely that Invoke Calamity can join that list. Maybe the most direct comparison is Finale of Promise. Finale of Promise, if you cast it for 5 mana, it's actually very similar. Finale of Promise for 5 mana lets you cast a 3 mana value instant and a 3 mana value sorcery from your graveyard without paying their mana cost, blah, 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 blah. That's kind of the same as Invoke Calamity. You get different kinds of flexibility. The flexibility of Finale of Promise is you can cast it for 3 mana or even 2 mana and cast no mana value instants and sorceries. Invoke Calamity is always going to be 5 mana, but then you have a ton of flexibility once you pay that cost. You can cast one big 6 mana spell, you can cast 2 3 mana spells, you can cast a 5 mana spell and a 1 mana spell, plus you get the flexibility of hitting your hand. So I think that Invoke Calamity, it serves a slightly different purpose than Finale of Promise. Like, Finale of Promise, the most powerful thing it does in Constructed right now is to cast it for 3 mana and flashback to 1 mana value spells, just to like get back your Arclight Phoenixes or whatever. Invoke Calamity can do the same trick. You're still getting 3 spells to get back an Arclight Phoenix, but it's going to cost 5 mana every time. So I don't think they're competing for the same roles. They do very different things. So the downside of Invoke Calamity is, compared to something like Mizzix Mastery, it's never going to let you cast that one massive game-ending sorcery. Like Mizzix Mastery getting back a Emergent Ultimatum, the mana value restriction is going to keep Invoke Calamity from doing that, which is probably a good thing. On the other hand, being an instant is a ridiculously huge upside. Most of the other spells we were talking about, Finales and Goblin Dark Dwellers and so forth, they're cards that you can only cast at sorcery speed. We've seen with Teferi Time Raveler being able to like instant speed a Wrath, instant speed a Time Warp, instant speed, if you want to be really mean, an Armageddon effect. Like, that is incredibly powerful, and that's something Invoke Calamity lets you do. Like, this card as a sorcery would be much less exciting, but this card is an instant, allowing you to leave up all your mana, cast it on your opponent's end step or during combat on your opponent's turn. I think that makes this card really, really exciting, at least for Standard and maybe for older formats as well. The other thing is, you can technically use this as a ramp spell. Like, you're spending 5 mana, and if you can get max value out of Invoke Calamity, you are getting 6 mana value worth of spells. I don't think this is necessarily a good idea, but you could just Invoke Calamity and cast a Storm the Festival from your hand, or a Body of Research from your hand on your opponent's end step, even, like breaking the timing rules of these big sorceries. So that's something to keep in mind, that it does work that way as well. Also in older formats, can let you cast no mana value stuff, Crashing Footfalls, Ancestral Visions, all those spells, because you're casting the spell without paying its mana cost. So you can just Invoke Calamity and cast 2 Footfalls and Living Ends, whatever. So that's another upside. I think what I'm most excited about is using it with land destruction lines up really well with cards like Stone Rain and Pillage, where like in a modern land destruction deck, you start blowing up lands, cast a Stone Rain on turn 3, a Pillage on turn 4, turn 5, Invoke Calamity, Stone Rain, Pillage again, get rid of essentially all of your opponent's lands, and this could actually be a pretty legitimate plan in the right land destruction deck in a format like Modern. So I think Invoke Calamity has potential there. In Standard, I think this could just be a good control card. Like, control decks have a lot of spells, and they're already playing spell copying stuff. Like, imagine doubling up a Invoke Calamity with Galvanic Iteration, or getting a Jin-Gitaxias, the new one, on the battlefield and invoking multiple times. Like, that's kind of absurd value. That's just so many spells being slung. So just stick it in a random control deck. Also, definitely hyped to try this in the Storm deck we played. We played Kaya Storm, which is using like Storm Kiln Artist to make a bunch of treasure tokens. Invoke Calamity works really well there, giving us 3 spells, kind of the Arclight Phoenix tricks we were talking about earlier. 3 spells with 1 card, that's a lot of treasure tokens, especially if you got Kaya going. Also could maybe be the top end of the curve in some sort of Prowess or Magecraft deck, depending on how aggro your curve is, but this is 3 spells in 1 card. Like, imagine how many bodies you're gonna get with a Mana Form Hellkite if you cast an Invoke Calamity. Like, you're getting a 5/5 from Invoke, and then 2 more bodies most likely, depending on what you cast with Invoke, and then, like, you could just play it as the top end of your curve in some sort of, like, Prowess or Magecraft deck. Like, imagine how big your Clever Lumimancers and Swift Spears and Soulscar Mage are going to be when you resolve all these spells in the same turn. And I also think this probably has a lot of potential in Spellslinger decks in Commander. One of the things I want in pretty much every Commander deck is some way to recur things from my graveyard. Invoke Calamity is a good way to get this done in a spell deck. Like, this is a way you can reuse a Wrath, reuse a counter spell since it's an instant, whatever your most important spells are, some card draw spells. So if you're playing Viren or Calamax or Kark or Niv Mizzet, whatever, I think this is at least in the conversation for your deck. If you got a ton of spells, this is almost always going to be worth the 5 mana you're spending on it, especially since it's an instant. Like, I just can't get over the fact that this is instant. So that is Invoke Calamity. Card's really powerful. Excited to cast it and see what it can do. Being an instant kind of blows my mind, but I think we'll see this one in Standard. Maybe like fringe uses in Modern or Legacy in like a Storm deck, or getting back free spells, and definitely in Spellslinger and Commander too. Finally today, in the world of lower rarity cards, we got a bunch of stuff that probably is mostly for limited, although there are 2 or 3 cards I want to mention in specific. First, Menacing Slash is kind of interesting. Double white mana, destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Then if you control an artifact and an enchantment, you get a 2/2 samurai creature token with vigilance. That's a lot of flexibility for 2 mana. The problem is it's a sorcery. If this was an instant, I would be super hyped for this card. I think this would be very, very constructed playable. Being a sorcery though, we'll have to wait and see. It is still very flexible. It's 1 card that can technically kill an artifact, an enchantment, or a creature, which makes me think potential sideboard applications. And then if you're in the right deck, maybe you even get a creature out of it too. Like, that's an insane deal for 2 mana. If it was instant, it would be great, because then you could snipe the tap creature before it hits you. As a sorcery, that mostly means you gotta like take the attack from the creature and then kill it. But still, I could see this showing up in a disenchant style sideboard slot, especially if you're a deck that can have both an artifact and an enchantment and maybe get the token out of it. Also worth noting, Tempered in Solitude, 2 mana enchantment that says when a creature you control attacks alone, exile the top card of your library and you can play it this turn. So card advantage on a 2 mana enchantment. The awkward part here is, I don't know where this card fits. Most red aggro decks are going to be going wide with a bunch of small creatures, which would mean Tempered in Solitude does nothing, because unless you're attacking with exactly 1 creature, it's not doing anything at all. But if there is a deck that wants this, some sort of Voltron style deck where you're only planning on really attacking with 1 big thing every turn anyway, this is kind of a 2 mana draw card every single turn, even with the red drawback of having to cast it this turn. That's still a really powerful effect. So I think it's designed for kind of the exalted archetype. We see that with the Shari Captain up at the top. There's a pseudo exalted attack with 1 thing mechanic. So I think that's the goal, but I do think maybe in a Voltron Commander deck, or maybe some sort of Boggles style deck where you're just loading up 1 creature with a bunch of auras and that's your game plan, Tempered in Solitude is cheap enough that it's worth considering. I also want to mention quickly Bamboo Grove Archer, 2 mana 3/3 enchantment creature, a snake archer with Defender and Reach, and also has Channel, so you can pay 5 and discard it to blow up a creature with flying. This seems like a pretty good blocker. I could see this maybe being a sideboard option. Like, this is 1 card that in the early game, you drop it down and it kind of stonewalls a lot of threats against mono white, trades up with a lot of mono green things, and then later in the game, you can use the Channel ability to blow up a Goldspan Dragon or something, not super efficiently, but still being good against aggro, being good against big dragons in the late game, maybe gives it enough flexibility to be in the conversation for sideboard slots. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. I know not the longest spoiler video, we're kind of in the weekend, so we get spoilers, but not a ton of them. Tomorrow, things will pick back up with our full spoiler week. So let me know what you think about these new cards. What are you hyped for? What are you looking forward to starting tomorrow when we pick back up in earnest? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow, hopefully with a better voice, we'll see, with some daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular Sunday, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more spoiler content? Well, every day during spoiler season, we publish a daily spoiler video going over all the sweet new cards and synergy, so you can check them out here and here.